Okay, we are online. So, good evening all. Good to see you. Welcome to those that are joining us online. And I got to tell you, today is a special day. It's my oldest granddaughter's birthday. 7 years old today. Goodness gracious, man, this is hard to believe. She's 7 years old. It is. And my youngest just turned 3, but with Natalie now, she's 7. And at her school, they have what they call guest readers. And I've done it before, and since it was her birthday, signed up to be a guest reader. And of course, met her mom over there, and we took a big old thing, 21 kids in the class, but they let you bring cupcakes on a day like that. So I ordered cupcakes, 30 of them from Sam's, and plenty of cupcakes. So went in, and Natalie, she was able to pick out a book that she wanted me to read, and so she actually brought 3. But one of them, was about this thick. It was a big book, about this thick. She and her mom went and bought them yesterday at Ollie's. I could see the orange Ollie's tag on there. And so I figured out the reason why it was at Ollie's, because they kind of do like clearance and discounted things. Because when I looked at the outside of it, it was a book about unicorns, our little girls and unicorns. And so I look at it, okay, and I open it up, and the inside was upside down. That's why it was on sale. So I opened it up, and I start reading. I read the first section, and I turned to the teacher and I said, "Are we good for more?" She said, "Yeah." So I keep on reading. I need to read another section. I turn and say, "Are we good?" "Yeah." So I read all the way through that book. I'm telling you, it was like that thick. And the whole time I'm doing this stuff, the way the teacher's supposed to do, and you're out here like this, my arm was tired. So by the time I got finished, and it was warm in there classroom, by the time I got finished, one little girl sitting in the back, as soon as I got to the end part, she says, "You're sweating." And I said, "Yes, I am." I said, "I'm very hot-natured." I said, "Listen, I'm a preacher. I sweat when I preach. So there's nothing new, So we had a good time. So, well, I don't know if anybody got a picture of it, but probably did. I think the teacher was over there taking pictures, and Shay too. So, all right. So we're in 1 Samuel chapter 14 this evening. So if you'll take your Bibles and open them to 1 Samuel 14. We'll mention, sent out an email yesterday about some areas that we need to get filled and some help that we need, and I've had several people contacting me and sharing with me, and it seems to be resonating with people. So here's one of the things I want to mention, and I'll talk about this Sunday and a few more weeks going forward. Here's what we're really looking for. We're not looking for people, we're not wanting to pull people out of their life groups full time. I get it. A lot of people, that's one of the reasons why a lot of people don't serve either as a greeter or so forth and so on, especially as a greeter, because they think we're going to pull them out of their life group full time. Listen, if we can just get enough people who would say, "Hey, I'll take this week and that week and this week," and you wouldn't even have to miss your entire life group, maybe just like I said in the email, maybe get there a little bit late, leave a few minutes early, whatever the case may be. We could do that and get a rotating thing going on. That's good for everybody. And so I really hope and ask that you would give that consideration, because those are critical things. And of all the things in there, they're all important. Child care, the greeters, security on any level. But the two things that will really make you or break you, especially when you're trying to target younger families, child care and greeting. As I mentioned in the email, research shows over and over and over again that first impression. And as it goes, you only get one shot at making a good impression. And they say that most people, when they visit a church, they have made up their mind within the first 5 minutes of whether they will be back. Isn't that interesting? That tells you how critical the greeting ministry is. And the folks that we've got doing it, they do a tremendous job, but they need help, and we're going to need a lot more, just as I said. So I ask you if you would just prayerfully think about that, pray about it, and as I said, make a little sacrifice, you know, and because the sacrifice makes the offering even sweeter to the Lord when we do that. Okay? All right. Yes, sir.
If anyone misses their life group because they're volunteering, I have an option for you to come on Sunday night to a life group at 6 o'clock.
There you go. See? See, if you do happen to miss it, we got an alternative, right? That's one of the things. Options. Options on the table.
It's one of the biggest classes.
Yeah, they've got a really good group going. So, all right. So 1 Samuel chapter 14. Now, last week we were in chapter 13, and so if you remember, basically the end result of chapter 13 is this: is that we discover that Saul is reverting to some of his old ways. Okay. Old ways of disobedience, self-will, impatience, presumptuousness. You know, you remember last week where he was really presumptive was, and impatience and disobedience played a part, where Samuel had said, listen, in 7 days I'll be there, getting late in the day, and Saul was getting antsy on that 7th day. So he decided that he would take upon himself the privilege which was not his, which was to make a sacrifice and offering to the Lord, which only the priest Samuel should have done. And because of that, if you remember last week, the Lord said, because you have done this, your kingdom has been stripped from you. Now, he rules for a number of years beyond that, but but also in that time, God had said, basically, if you would had just stayed in your lane, kept your heart right with me, I would establish your throne forever. But it didn't. So that's the whole point about chapter 13 is that it was a test. Chapter 13 and 14 really are the two chapters that begin to illustrate how radical a shift Saul is making back towards his old secular carnal ways. And his heart is not with the Lord. And that's the bottom line. That's the most important thing. And on top of that, not only that, but the plan of attacking the Philistines, which we find out as we go along he initiated, it all went sideways. They didn't kick the Philistines out. The Philistines increased their territory, plus they began sending 3 raiding parties out into Israel, plundering the Israelites. So it didn't go well. So that brings us to chapter number 14, and the first part of chapter 14 is primarily focused upon Jonathan. And we start out in verses 1 through 3 talking about Jonathan's faith mission. That's the way I decided to label it. And we see something like what's going to happen here. Basically, he's going to go and engage the Philistines, just like we saw in chapter 13. That took place under his father, but it has a different end this time. But here's one of the things I want to mention before we actually get into the text, and that is this. There is a clear contrast that you see in chapter 13. Now, we won't finish all of it. We're going to deal with the first half that deals primarily with Jonathan. Next week, we'll come back and deal with the half that focuses on Saul, okay? But even in these early verses here, here's what you see. There is a clear contrast between the spirit of Jonathan and the spirit of his father, Saul. Okay? So just keep that in mind. We'll come back to that in just a moment. So Jonathan's faith mission, beginning in verses 1 through 3, verse 1 says this. Now it happened one day that Jonathan, the son of Saul, said to the young man who bore his armor, "Come, let us go over to the Philistines' garrison that is on the other side." Now, let me stop and ask you a question. You don't hear a lot of conversation about the armor bearers. What did the armor bearers do? What do you know about them?
They carried the armor.
Okay, that was one of the things that they did, that they carried the armor for their commanding officer. But did you know they actually had a little bit bigger role than that? They actually assisted the officer in administrating the army. Okay? So he had a broader responsibility than just bearing the armor. Thus, that's where the title comes from, armor bearer. But he had a bigger role. It also was expected that an armor bearer, in order to carry out his role well, he had to be brave, he had to be loyal, because his commanding officer's life, in a lot of ways, depended on it. Okay? So the armor bearer is a very important ally and assistant to an officer like Jonathan in the army of Israel. And then, by the way, remember, at this point, it's really a fledgling army. We saw in chapter 13 last week, it was like 3,000 men, you know, and they don't even have proper weapons of war, only Saul and Jonathan. And so Jonathan said to him, "Come, let us go over to the Philistine garrison that is on the other side." Now, what he's talking about is this. Last week, there was Gibeah, which is kind of almost due north of Jerusalem. And then there was another place northeast, a few miles of Jerusalem, called Geba, and Michmash was close to it because that's where Saul was at the time. So that's what he's talking about, is that same area that they were dealing with in chapter number 13. So Israel's in a military conflict, obviously, with the Philistines. Been having problems with them even before we get to this particular chapter and everything. They are outnumbered and they're outgunned, so to speak, because the Philistines, they've got some really nice weapons of warfare. The Israelites, not so much. They've got sticks and rakes and hoes, and that's about it, okay? But yet, Jonathan was bold enough to go on this mission. And at this point, it's really more of a reconnaissance mission. But if he gets the green light, he's ready to go in for the fight, okay? Basically, the idea being is to, in a sense, undo and correct what transpired previously, and especially these raiding parties that are going out into among the Israelites. And so you think about, man, here he is after what happened, and he knows between him and the armor bearer, he's the only one with a sword. Don't know what the armor bearer is carrying, okay? But he's bold enough to go out into doing this. So you got to think, Jonathan, unlike his father, proves to be a very spiritually minded man. So maybe he had in mind the judge that we read about in the book of Judges, basically only one verse, Shamgar, who got a victory over the Philistines, 600 of them with a stick, okay? Maybe he was mindful of the teaching of Leviticus 26:8 that said, 5 of you shall chase 100, and 100 of you shall put 10,000 to flight. Your enemies shall fall by the sword before you. So certainly Jonathan thought differently than his father did, and that's borne out as we go all through this. But then the latter part of verse 1 says, but he did not tell whom? His father. I wonder why. Why do you think he didn't tell his father? What are some possible reasons why he didn't tell Saul he was going to do this? Any ideas? Possibility he might say no. Okay. Another possibility is he might have just not really thought about it. He was so anxious to go and do what he was going to do. Another issue may be kind of related to the no answer was, I think Jonathan knew something was not right with his father. Now, he remained loyal to his father, okay? And he also knew that what had transpired last time needed to be undone, okay? So the bottom line is we're not really certain as to why. Verse number 2 says, and Saul was sitting in the outskirts of Gibeah under a pomegranate tree, which is in Migron. The people who were with him were about 600 men. Ahijah, now listen to this list right here, okay, of who's with him. Ahijah, the son of Ahitub, Ichabod's brother, the son of Phinehas, the son of Eli, the Lord's priest in Shiloh, was wearing an ephod, but the people did not know that Jonathan had gone. Now, what stands out to you about the list of people that's with Saul in Gibeah? Yeah, they're not from a very good line, right? And if you remember in Judges, because of Hophni and Phinehas, and because of Eli's failure to correct his sons and so forth, God had said, Eli, your house is coming to an end. Now, obviously, it has not by this time. It does further on as we get further on into the scriptures in the Old Testament. But here's the deal. And look at this. Ahijah, the son of Ahitub, is Ichabod's brother, the son of Phinehas. Phinehas was not a good dude. And you got to, assume some of this stuff's probably passed on down. They're a lot like their forefathers and everything. And then notice this also. It says that the Lord's priest, Ahijah, in Shiloh, was wearing an ephod. Now, what was the ephod? You remember? It was a chest plate, part of the dress of the priest, okay? So that's one piece of it, all right? It was a part of the priest's dress, okay, the high priest. But what else? There's something else about the ephod that stands out. What was it used for? It was more than just a decoration. It was used in connection with the Urim and Thummim to discern God's will. Okay? In other words, God used this to communicate and to speak with them in some manner. Okay? And so the priest is wearing the ephod, which is more than just a piece of dress. It's also used in communicating and discerning God's will. But notice this. It says this. But the people did not know that Jonathan had gone. Okay? Now, there's an inference in that to me. Now, this is just what I read out of that. Okay? It didn't seem to me like God was talking to them or they aren't listening. They didn't have a clue. And so we see Jonathan's off on this faith mission, okay? Right now, it's a reconnaissance mission. Now, look at verses 4 through 12. Jonathan's discernment of the situation. Look, verse 4 says this. Between the passes by which Jonathan sought to go over to the Philistines' garrison, there was a sharp rock on one side and a sharp rock on the other side. So this path that he's on, that he comes upon, has a sharp pointed and maybe even a rock with a sharp edge pointing northward and another one pointing southward, okay? And it's a narrow pass through there. And the name of one was Bozez. Now, Bozez means shining, okay? And the name of the other was Senna, and it means thorn. Now, here's my translation of that. Jonathan is about to become a shining thorn in the side of the Philistines, all right? Verse 5. The front one faced northward opposite Michmash, and the other southward opposite. Now, if you're reading New King James or King James, it says Gibeah. That should be Gibeah, okay? I mentioned last week, those two names get confused a lot, and you see a lot of it in the King James and New King James version, okay? So basically, here's what that is. That's the garrison that Saul originally sent Jonathan and his troops up against to start with in chapter 13, all right? By the way, I want to go back just a minute to verse number 2, because here's some of the contrast that you see with Jonathan and Saul. So Jonathan's off on this bold reconnaissance mission. What is Saul doing? He's kicked back under a shade tree, right? Probably drinking an Arnold Palmer, taking it easy. And so you see the contrast that begins to develop here. Jonathan's this bold, good, godly, spiritually minded man who says, something's wrong, we can't let this stand. And Saul, who, by the way, remember, he initiated the expedition, the conflict in chapter 12 or chapter 13, but it blew up in his face. And the situation was worse afterwards than it was before. He's sitting back under a shade tree like, big deal, who cares? And you got raiding parties going out into Israel doing nothing about it. And Jonathan saying, this can't stand. Somebody has got to step up and do something. You want to know something? That is a mark that you'll find in most of the great movements. You find it in Scripture. You'll find it throughout church history. Most of the great movements, revivals, mission endeavors, mission agencies, those kinds of things that have gotten started over history typically come down to one man or one woman in some instances who have said somebody's got to step up and do something. Most of the great movements that God is behind and starting starts with one person.
Brother Steve,
Yes, sir.
I kind of thought it was possible that Jonathan saw how bad a job his dad was doing. I think that might be the reason he didn't want to go talk about it, because he didn't need his help, he needed God's help.
Well, yeah, well, that's what I mentioned at the beginning is that I think Jonathan was very much aware that things weren't going well and weren't right with his father, okay? And so, yeah, I think that definitely is factoring into what's going on here, okay? So on the way towards this garrison, he comes upon this strategic place that is a pass through these two sharp rocks, and it was shaped in such a way that it was an excellent place for a small number of men to take on a larger number of men, because it's going to be kind of like a tunnel factor. And so they end up fighting 20 guys. 20 guys can't get through there at one time, okay? But here's the thing. Had Jonathan not at least followed what he sensed in his heart, that something's not right, something's got to be done, and that tugging and that urging in his heart, he would never have come upon this strategic place that was going to be a critical part to what transpires. Verse 6, then Jonathan said to the young man who bore his armor, come, let us go over to the garrison of these uncircumcised. It may be that the Lord will work for us. Now, do you notice he hasn't come to a final conclusion yet as to what he will do or should do. He just knows that in his heart, he senses this tugging that something's not right, somebody's got to do something. Let's just look at what may develop here, okay, and where the Lord may lead. And he goes on, he says, and he makes this great statement, which is one of the great statements in Scripture that talks about, for nothing restrains the Lord from saving by many or by few. How many of you know that the size of God's army, it doesn't matter if it's a large army or a small army. All that matters is it's God's army, right? Here you got an army of 2 right now, okay, in this passage right here. In some places you got an army of 1. Other places you got an army of hundreds or thousands and so forth. But it doesn't, in God's army, it doesn't matter if there are many or few, because the number in the army are not going to be what determines the outcome. God is the one that determines the outcome. Amen? So he says, for nothing restrains the Lord from saving by many or by few. And I'll guarantee you that there were many in Israel who would have said, amen, brother, I agree with you. As a theological truth, they believed that. But they weren't willing to go and do like Jonathan and act on it. See, what Jonathan's doing is he's putting to practice James 2:18. He's letting his works show his faith. You know, James talks about, you say you have faith and you don't have to have your works and stuff, you know. And so he says, well, I'll show you my faith by my works. And that's what Jonathan's doing. Verse 7. So his armor bearer said to him, do all that is in your heart. Go then, here I am with you, according to your heart. Then Jonathan said, very well, let us cross over to these men, and we will show ourselves to them. If they say thus to us, wait until we come to you, then we will stand still in our place and not go up to them. But if they say thus, come up to us, then we will go up. For the Lord has delivered them into our hand, and this will be a sign to us. Now, you remember in verse number 6, he says, it may be that the Lord will work with us. See, Jonathan's still seeking and trying to discern what God wants him to actually do. Jonathan's making himself available. He's just waiting to see if God says go or whoa. That's all he's doing. And so he comes up with a simple test and said, here's how we'll know that God is working on our behalf. If we show ourselves and we make ourselves known to these Philistines, and if they say, don't come up here, then we know we're to leave it alone. But if they say, yeah, you guys come on up here with us, then we know God's with us and we know what we're supposed to do. Now some might say, well, isn't that a fleece like Gideon put out? No, it's not. The difference between what Jonathan's doing and what Gideon did is this. Jonathan didn't have a clear word from God on what to do. He's just open to and searching for the possibilities of what God may do. He's looking for a clear word. Gideon had a clear word, but he doubted. And so that's the reason why he said, okay, God, I'm going to put the fleece out, make it wet. Next time, okay, no, I wasn't going to make it dry. See, he had a word from God. What Jonathan's looking for is a clear word. Jonathan's doing just like what the Scriptures tells us. Seek the Lord. Seek after the Lord. Sometimes, in order to do God's will, the first and most important thing we've got to do is seek Him and see where He leads. We don't know. Okay? So, verse number 11. So both of them showed themselves to the garrison of the Philistines. And the Philistines said, look, the Hebrews are coming out of the holes where they have hidden. Now, I would suggest you circle or make a note, because that's going to become a self-fulfilling prophecy. None of the Philistines could claim to be prophets of God, but that's going to become a self-fulfilling prophecy, okay? And so they're coming out of the holes where they've hidden. Verse 12. And then the men of the garrison called to Jonathan and his armor bearer and said, come up to us and we will show you something. And I can just imagine that Jonathan and the armor bearer is thinking, says, oh no, they're the ones going to get showed something, you know? Come on, we're going to show you something. Jonathan said to his armor bearer, come up after me, for the Lord has delivered them into the hand of Israel. And isn't it interesting? He doesn't say he has delivered them into my hand, our hand. He says God has delivered them into whose hand? Israel. Because they're doing this not for themselves, but on behalf of the people. And so God had given him a clear answer to his prayer. Should I go? Shouldn't I go? God says you should go. Okay? So he has discerned what it is he needs to do. Verses 12 through 14, Jonathan attacks the Philistines. And Jonathan climbed up on his hands and knees with his armor bearer after him. And they, that is the Philistines, fell before Jonathan. And as he came after him, his armor bearer killed them. So you can kind of get the picture. And remember, they're in this area where these sharp rocks are. And the Philistines are having to climb up to them. And as they're coming up and meeting each other, Jonathan's taking them down. Maybe they're wounded. The armor bearer is coming behind them, and with that pitchfork, he's finishing them off, you know. He's making an hors d'oeuvre out of them, all right? And so that's what's going on. And that's the reason why that pass was so important to them. And so he goes on and says, and by the way, it says, the NIV reads like this: the Philistines fell before Jonathan, and his armor bearer followed and killed behind him. Verse 14. That first slaughter or attack which Jonathan and his armor bearer made was about 20 men within about half an acre of land, which literally means the equivalent of a land plowed by an oxen in a day, which would be about what we say an acre, okay? So through the course, over a course of about half an acre or so, they have killed 20 men. Now, they're not actually into the actual fortified garrison yet. Right? They're on the outskirts of it. Then we come to verses 15 through 23 where we see, now notice, it changes here. So the Lord has given the Israelites into the hand of Israel, but here it becomes the Lord's victory, as it is obviously. Verse 15. And there was trembling or terror in the camp. Now, which camp? The Philistines. There was terror in the camp, in the field, and among all the people. And so now the engagement spreads from the initial engagement of those 20 to the garrison itself. And so it says, the garrison and the raiders also trembled. I like that statement, because think about it. Remember those raiders that are going out into Israel and they're plundering and pillaging and all that sort of stuff? They're coming in there to these helpless Israelites who have no weapons, they can't defend themselves, and they're big bad dudes, and they're shooting their mouth off, and who knows what all kind of atrocities that they've committed. Like they're the toughest thing on the earth. And here it says they trembled. The garrison and the raiders trembled, and the earth quaked. From what? What it was from the people running in panic. They were at absolute sheer panic. And so it was that it was a very great trembling. And some translations actually add sent by God, because some of the ancient texts indicate that may be the actual way it should be translated, that the great trembling was sent by God, which is obvious. We know that. Verse 16. Now the watchmen of Saul in Gibeah, where they were located, they were keeping an eye on the garrison. And they looked, and there was the multitude, so they were able to see the Philistines, and it says they were melting away. So as they looked out, and they could look over there, and they could see all these Philistines, but it's like all of a sudden they were disappearing, melting away. It was just like beginning to just become less and less like a wax candle, and the fire is just eating it up. It's disappearing. And so they see it melting away, and they went here and there. What was going on is that the Philistines were in a state of confusion. They were turning on one another, and they were killing one another. Verse 17. And then Saul said to the people who were with him, now call the roll and see who has gone from us. And when they had called the roll, surprisingly, Jonathan and his armor bearer were not there. And Saul said to Ahijah the priest, bring the ark of God here, for at that time the ark was with the children of Israel, which we know previously for a period of time it had not been. But Saul, if he had been astute, he would have remembered history. Because remember, how was the ark lost initially to the Philistines? You remember? Yeah. The Israelites had lost the battle. They said, let's bring out the ark, thinking it's going to be a lucky charm and guarantee our victory. If Saul had been an astute man and learned from history, he would have known that. But in the end, they don't bring out the ark. Verse 19. Now it happened while Saul talked to the priest that the noise which was in the camp of the Philistines continued to increase. So Saul said to the priest, withdraw your hand. In other words, hold on a minute, don't bring the ark, something's going on. Verse 20, then Saul and all the people who were with him assembled, and they went to the battle. And indeed, every man's sword was against his neighbor, and there was a great confusion. In other words, the Philistines have already turned on one another. They're killing each other. They're in a state of mind of madness and blindness, and they're killing each other. And so the Israelites come in, and they start killing off the rest of them. I mean, it was like picking off birds sitting on a fence row. Verse 21. Moreover, the Hebrews who were with the Philistines before that time, who went up with them into the camp from the surrounding country, they also joined the Israelites who were with Saul and Jonathan. So apparently, turncoats, I don't know, they stayed with the Philistines for whatever, maybe, we don't know, but there were some Hebrews among the Philistines. They get involved in the battle. Likewise, the men who hid in the mountains of Ephraim, when they heard that the Philistines fled, they also followed hard after them in the battle. Now remember what I said about that self-fulfilling prophecy? Okay. And then verse 23, we conclude with it. It says this: so the Lord saved Israel that day, and then the battle shifted to Beth-aven, which we deal with later. But here was the thing. Clearly, God's signature is on the victory. Now here you got to ask yourself the question. Because essentially, what Jonathan ends up accomplishing is what Saul, in a sense, intended to accomplish. But with Saul, it went one way. With Jonathan, it went a completely different way. And so, what was the difference? Yeah, God certainly for sure, but what about in terms of Saul and Jonathan? What was the difference? Why was it that God did not work on behalf or with Saul, but he did Jonathan?
Jonathan was waiting to get a sign from God of what to do with Saul.
There was never a commandment. There was no clear word to Saul, first of all, in chapter 13. Jonathan looks for a clear word from God. Okay, that's one factor. But what's another factor? So let's think about it like this. We'll jump forward. Towards the end of Saul's reign, he still has a few years left. God starts looking for another king. Okay? And he sends Samuel to Bethlehem, right? And he goes to the house of Jesse. And Jesse brings out all of his older sons and so forth. And Samuel goes through all of them. He's not here. You got any more? Yeah, the young'un, he's out there with the sheep. Go get him. Bring him here. They bring David. As soon as Samuel sees David, he says, this is the one. And it's in that context where we're told, man looks on the outside. God looks at the heart. The real issue in chapter 13 with Saul was, yes, it was a test about whether or not whether his heart was with God or if it's going in a different direction. And we found out it's going in a different direction. Jonathan's heart was with God. Jonathan's one of the great character studies in the scriptures. Jonathan was a loyal man. He's a good, righteous man, a godly man, an excellent soldier, strong character. He had a heart for the Lord and for God's people. He was a humble man, a faithful man. The difference between Jonathan and his father, the biggest difference, was the heart. That was the primary difference. And I think in chapters 13 and 14, that's really the telling thing. The heart. Whether heart was with God, for God, or not. Saul was not, Jonathan was. Okay? All right, any questions? Yes, Daryl?
I guess, I didn't really have never thought about it that way, but it's kind of, it's really tough to do what Jonathan did, and that's go into a situation not really knowing the plan, but having the heart to depend on God to give it to you. He didn't know when, and he didn't know what it was, but he trusted him. And he marched forward where most people would say, whoa, let's back up here and try to figure this out before we go any further.
Yeah.
He just moved, like you said earlier, he just moved forward and moved it, or had confidence in his heart that God would eventually tell him what to do, and he did.
So for those online, Daryl's comment is the fact of how Jonathan handled himself, and that he was waiting on God, but he was willing to keep going forward, not really knowing. But there are two things again. There was in his heart a sense of of drawing and urging, and he was following that, which God was obviously working in his heart. But then again, that comes back to the whole idea. Isn't that what faith is supposed to look like anyway? And the great example of that is Abraham, who followed God and left one country and goes to another, not knowing where he was going. But that is in essence really what it means to walk by faith, because the truth is we only know what we know, and that's limited at best. And in many ways what we're doing is waiting on God showing us what is the next step and moving forward. And typically that's the way God works in our life, isn't it? I mean, in the scriptures he gives us basic things that need to be incorporated into our faith walk day in and day out. But when it comes to some certain particular directions or things he wants us to do, and he puts it in our heart, and we say, well, I'm not really sure about how this is going to work or how to do it or how to get there. But we start putting one foot in front of the other with what little bit that he gives us, and that's the way God works. He shows us what we need for the next step. Very seldom does God ever lay out the full map going forward. Because if he did that, where's faith? That's the reason why we have to trust him to show us one step after the other. Okay? All right, anybody else? All right, very well. We will conclude. Thank you for joining us online. You all have a good evening. God bless you.